Hello and welcome to Fidelity Connects, a Fidelity Investments Canada podcast, connecting you to the world of investing and helping you stay ahead. With the rise of AI, cybersecurity is becoming a growing concern for all sectors of the economy. Today we're joined by Imran Ahmad, Canadian cybersecurity expert and partner and head of technology at global law firm Norton Rose Fulbright. Imran discusses how AI is changing the cybersecurity landscape for the investment sector and how advisors can best safeguard client information. He says the rise of deepfake technology is a real threat. Imran recommends advisors remain cautious and verify any unusual requests directly with clients. Monitoring client behavior is vital, as is taking note of any financial transactions that deviate from your client's typical patterns. Imran says advisors should stay on top of evolving and changing privacy laws in Canada. Our country has 24 different privacy and data protection laws, so it's important to know the obligations under federal and provincial laws in order to fully protect your client's data. This podcast was recorded on August 27th, 2024.
So we're going to be talking about cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, privacy, real hot topics today, and things that advisors need to be aware of in today's environment. And so I'm going to start off by asking you, what have the hackers been up to? What are some cyber trends you've been seeing recently?
So hackers are busy, they're crafty, and it's a bit like figuring out what the least path of resistance is going to be. And I say this to our clients all the time, it's always move and counter move. So when you think of other types of risks, a fire, a flood, it's pretty static. But when you're thinking about cyber, very dynamic. So if you have great backups, they'll find another way to get into your system and cause harm. So what are they doing? Three things. One, ransomware is still a hot area.
Ooh.
So they get into your system, they lock up your data, and you're basically unable to do anything for a long period of time, unless you pay a ransom. Number two, stealing data. They love data, and they're really, really smart now. Back in the day, they would just break in, grab whatever they could, and exit. Now they're actually getting into the system, understanding what data is valuable. And I think for your advisors in particular that were in the audience here, you collect a lot of information, for example, that's personal and sensitive in nature. Hackers know that. So they will target those organizations. They'll look at folders that say insurance or HR or customer information profile. They'll look for that information, spend time in it undetected, and then when the time is right, steal it over a period of days or even weeks. And the third one they're doing, which is pretty interesting, is they're using a lot of artificial intelligence to get into systems. And they're scaling up big time. They're super organized, and I'm sure we'll get into this, organized as a crime group, but also as a supply chain. So very effective in terms of the number of attacks that they're actually perpetrating across the world.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is pretty scary. I want to break it down for advisors. In terms of what they can do to protect themselves. We know that advisors are sort of subject to the security infrastructure of their dealer. Mm-hmm. So that's a safeguard there. But I'm sure that there are things that advisors can do every day, things to be savvy and protect against, these cyber criminals that could potentially access client information. So what are the top things that our advisors should be thinking about, like low-hanging fruit, like don't do A, B, and C. Don't click on that link. We know that. But are there any others?
So let me give you a bigger picture perspective on this. So what hackers are doing, think of a filing cabinet. Remember back in the day, we used to have those metal filing cabinets? So
we still have them.
I'm sure we do.
You still have them too.
We definitely do at our firm. And what they would do, these hackers, is they would press that little button that locks the filing cabinet. So if you had an extra key, it's like your backup, you didn't actually need to make a deal with a hacker. And that's what companies started doing. They basically had good backups in place. They didn't need the key. And they said, hacker, don't want to deal with you. So again, move, counter move. Hackers figured out, before I lock up the filing cabinet, let me steal some information out of it, which is what they did. So even if you are able to get your data, you may be inclined to safeguard some of this information. So coming back to the advisors, why is this relevant? So generally speaking, not all data is equal. When you talk about financial information or health information, those are the two areas that our laws in Canada and globally as well consider to be the most sensitive in nature, because you can do identity theft, You can take out mortgages, credit cards. You can do a lot of harm to somebody with that information.
So health information, financial information, that would be like
The price.
annual income, net worth. We know social insurance number is a key
Absolutely.
piece of sensitive personal information.
And that's what the hackers are looking for. And who has that information? Law firms do,
Yeah.
accountants do, professional services do, financial advisors do, absolutely. And so what can they do to protect that data and their organization? It sounds very analog. What I'm going to say to you is understand your clientele, understand what your clients typically do. Advisors are at the front line. They're asking critical questions. They know what your plans are. So let's say advisor is advising an elderly couple post-retirement, and they know that they're relying on a fixed income. They know their risk tolerance may be very low. A request to redeem or to transfer funds abnormally, not consistent with their plan, the advisor would be able to pick up something like that very, very quickly. That's one. Second thing they can do. Yep, go ahead.
I was going to say, so something that's unusual, out of the ordinary, doesn't make sense.
Right. Your spidey sense goes off and you go, this is weird. You know,
Okay.
you and your assistant or your colleagues in your organization can pick those up very, very quickly when you're interacting with your clients.
Okay.
Second thing, probably obvious as well, we have so many devices these days. You've got your laptop, you got your desktop, you got your phone, you got your iPad. They're not all well protected in every instance. So your computer, you may be coming in with a username and a password. Maybe you've got this thing called MFA, multi-factor authentication, but does your laptop have that as well? Are you saving things locally? How frequently are you changing your passwords? Make sure you've got complex passwords. It sounds very benign what I'm saying, but also very, very regularly. You don't want to wait until you're prompted. You want to do it almost on a regular cadence of a month or 2 months at most.
And multi-factor, you said MFA, multi-factor
Authentication.
authentication is that, so it just means that there are multiple methods of authenticating that it's you. And so I know sometimes you have to put in your phone number and then you get a code by text. And
so the idea there is you have a username. So whatever let's think of your email address, for example. If you want to access your email box, you're going to have a username. So it's Imran at whatever the username or the email service is. Then you have a password. So what hackers are able to do is they can run scripts. So these are sort of tools they run, and they can figure out, is it 1, 2, 3? Is it 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Or is it other combinations? They can brute force their way into an account. And it's not very difficult for them to do or time consuming. It just takes a couple of hours. The additional layer is, because your username is the same all the time, your password may be static for a while, you have this additional code which is generated on a regular cadence. So it may be changing every 5 minutes, it may be changing at whatever frequency you've decided. So even if the hacker gets your username and your password, they may not actually have your MFA access. Now they're getting smart. I mean, remember, move, counter move. They're actually figuring out that there are some ways to bypass MFA. So you may get a prompt saying, oh, your MFA is being double checked. Please validate, press a red or a green to say yes or no. Sometimes it's actually coming from the hacker. So you have to be extra diligent and extra careful. Why am I getting this request? Do I need to reset it? Something weird's going on. So that extra spidey sense piece, even on the MFA, is critical.
I mean, anytime I am asked to click validate anything that comes by text, by email, like I just don't do it. My spidey senses go up and I really make sure, because you don't want to be in a situation where somebody has hacked into, your computer and has access to all that sensitive personal information.
So I love you gave that example. So at our firm, and I'm sure a lot of the advisors who are watching today are doing this as well, we have our Outlook, we get our emails, and then we have a button in the corner that says, concerned phishing email.
We have the same thing.
Perfect.
Report phish.
I think I overuse it potentially, but our IT department prefers us being wrong and saying, yeah, no, this is a legit email and maybe delayed a few minutes or a few hours, than to click on something and inadvertently giving access to the entire content of the mailbox. One last point, you asked for three tips. Last thing is your mailbox. Don't keep information you don't need in there. It sounds obvious, but I'll give you an example. There are ways to configure your mailbox so it purges things every 6 months or moves it into an archive. So if the hacker got in, the worst that can happen is they will only have access to the last 6 months. And I know a lot of clients will reach out to advisors and say, look, here's a scan of my driver's license. Here's whatever, my credit card information or my banking details, whatever they need. Delete it right after you've actually inputted it. Just do a hard delete and then make sure you purge it every 6 months. We think we need everything. We actually don't need it. The number of times I talk to clients after the fact, they said, yeah, you know what? I don't know why I kept things for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years in some cases. Didn't need it. Wish I had purged it.
Right, but in the case of an advisor, their dealer will have policies around record retention. And in terms of that security infrastructure, that's something that's provided by the dealer, right? So maybe perhaps if advisors with a smaller shop, they have to think about that a bit more on their own end. But I'm thinking this is something that the dealer will be
They should be,
about.
hopefully, but it's all about implementation. I've had a ton of clients where they've had a cyber attack. They had all the right procedures in place. MFA was in place. They have a retention policy for the mailbox. But sometimes new laptop has been issued. Something was taken offline because they gave them a password temporarily while they set it up. You need to make sure you go back and set those things up properly for the MFA and the retention. New device, for example, or a new account that's being set up. A delegated access to your assistant, for example. Making sure those criteria are put in place is absolutely critical.
That's such important advice. So be wary, be diligent, make sure everything that's important from a security perspective, that's up to you to put in place, that you've done that and you've thought about it.
Absolutely.
Now, even if I do everything I'm supposed to do, like you said, hackers are very sophisticated and they're always finding workarounds. So let's say I am the victim of ransomware. What should I do? And explain what ransomware is. It seems very scary to me. So they've gone in, they potentially have access, or they do have access now to my client personal information, and they're going to ask something of me in order for them not to give that information out. Is that sort of what ransomware is?
Essentially. But let me give you a bigger picture of how the ransomware world actually operates, which is interesting. You talk to my mom, and she'll say, oh, it's some kid sitting in a dark room with a hoodie on, with Matrix-style computer screens and trying to break in. And I'm sure that happens from time to time. But the vast majority of these are organized like a supply chain. So you have one group, all they're trying to do is get, those emails you get, the phishing emails saying your product or your package has arrived from whatever vendor.
All the time, with the fake UPS logo.
Right, exactly. And then you put all the information, goes blank, and you don't hear anything from it. You go, well, if they really want to reach me, they'll reach me again.
I don't put that information in.
Good for you. So you're on the good list. But some people do. And once they collect that information, what they're doing is they're carving very specific phishing campaigns to get into those accounts. Once they've collected the username and password, they're done. They'll let the next group in the chain know, hey, here's the username and password. Chances are Imran's username and password is also being used for other applications at his organization. So what he's using for Gmail and what he's using, for example, for LinkedIn may be used elsewhere, most likely. So why don't you go and try to access those? So that's where that second group in the hacker chain goes in and then starts looking around. They just do reconnaissance. They're trying to figure out those files I was talking about. HR, client information, other information that may be valuable. And because they're using your legitimate credentials to get in and out, nobody really detects it as abnormal activity. Once they have all the data, third group comes in and they basically detonate the ransomware. So it's basically a bad software which goes in and locks up all of your files and all of your applications. So when you turn your computer on, you get a screen saying you've been locked out. Contact so-and-so. It looks very professional, but it's actually a hacker group saying, come and talk to me on the dark web, which is sort of the underbelly of the internet. It's not your Google search that you can get access to them that way.
That scares me.
And once all that is done, when your data has been taken out and everything's been locked up, the last group in the chain, the fourth one, is essentially going to say, well, now it's going to cost you. And here's how I want to get paid in cryptocurrency or whatever currency they want to get paid in. And then you're stuck. So how do you actually respond to that? Number one, and I tell this clients all the time, don't worry. There's a process, there's a methodology, and you're never going to be judged by the fact you had an incident. You're going to be judged on how you respond to it. So follow the process. And the process, number one, make sure you follow the instructions of your organization. So if you're at a dealer's infrastructure that you're using, inform the dealer. They probably have insurance in place. They have what we call a breach coach, typically a lawyer who's going to be quarterbacking the response.
You do that. You're a breach coach.
We are, and I am. Really, our goal is to make sure everything is privileged and confidential, that we look at the right things and we meet the regulatory requirements that a client may have as a result of the incident.
Yeah.
And really, what you want to do is act diligently, methodically, and be reasonable at the end of the day. So if, for example, a dealer's information was accessed or account was accessed and information of clients was taken out of the environment, what we call exfiltrated, you may have obligations under privacy legislation
Right.
or other regulatory obligations to notify other parties. You got to do that quickly. You have to be granular and specific, and there's a process of how you would do that normally. So break glass, follow the process, be methodical. Don't be worried about notifying people. It's not the fact you had a breach, it's how you respond to it that's going to be judged.
And there are people that can help you respond, privacy professionals, lawyers that do this every day. And so you're not alone if there's a situation like this where you really need that specialized advice. There are people that you can reach out to. But I agree that the dealer is sort of the first place to go, and then work with your dealer and
I
figuring
can
it.
tell you right now, Andrea, it's stressful for everyone, but moving quickly, very quickly and methodically helps a lot. Because once you put it out there, you said, look, we had an incident. We're notifying you as required by law. We're offering you potentially, let's say, credit monitoring or other tools to mitigate the damage. I can tell you in 99% of the clients or incidents that we manage, they come out stronger at the end. People understand. Regrettably, we're seeing a lot of cyber attacks these days. People generally understand, but it's in the speed of execution. If you wait 6 months to notify someone, they'll be very, very angry. If you notify them relatively quickly, they'll appreciate it.
Okay, I have to ask you this because I watch a lot of true crime dramas. Do people pay the ransom?
Yes.
Or people do
They
pay
do.
the ransom because of the value of the information?
There's all kinds of reasons why they pay, but you're exactly right. There's situations where they may say, look, it's my intellectual property. If I lose this source code, I'm dead in the water.
But how do you know the hacker is going to
Well,
not use the information after you?
You don't.
These aren't good people.
You don't. But here's the funny part, and it sounds counterintuitive when I say this. It's a business for them. They're in the business built on their reputation, if you can believe that. So hacker will say, look, I've got your data. You'll say, well, prove it to me. They'll say, here's a file list. Here's everything I took. And they're very forthcoming. They'll provide it to you, saying, here's all the 10,000 or 100,000 or whatever number of files we've taken from your environment. And then you'll say, well, I still don't believe you. How do I know you just didn't take a screenshot of all my files and not the actual underlying files? Say, well, pick 5. Pick any 5 from that list, top, bottom, middle, wherever you like, and let us know. And they will provide those to you. And then I'll say, well, forget about the data. What about the decryptor? My data's locked up. I don't know if you have a working decryptor. No problem. Why don't you give us a couple of encrypted files? We'll show you we can decrypt it within minutes. And then they do these deal terms. I know it sounds unbelievable. They'll say, here's the deal term. We'll give you a decryptor. We'll delete your data, and I'll come back to that in a second. And by the way, we're really nice people. We'll tell you how we broke into your environment too. And once the transfer is done and payment is made, they typically do it. Now, here's the kicker.
You see this. This is what you're
We
dealing.
see this. So just to give you an order of magnitude, just this year, in 2023, if the trend continues, we will have dealt with 550 cases. On average, just in Canada.
When you say we.
Norton Rose. Last year, we did roughly about the same number. The year prior, 500. So we see huge volume, and there are certain trend lines. There used to be a time, not too long ago, roughly about 18 months ago, when you made the payment, the data was really deleted. You didn't see it pop up on the dark web or anything bad happen afterwards. Now you're seeing a lot more rogue action by these hackers. So there's a lot of downside of making payment, and we discourage it when you can avoid it. Understand sometimes you have to, but there could be situations where you say, no, we're not going to make a payment.
What this says to me is that if you're dealing with client sensitive personal information or personal information, this is something you need to be thinking about every day.
Yeah.
Because they're thinking about it, and there's a whole business around this. So
well, and they scale up. They're very scalable right now. I know we talked a little bit about artificial intelligence. So what these hackers are doing, they're doing 2 things in particular right now. One is I can use a script. So I develop a little mini software. I'm the hacker, okay? So I'm developing this mini software, and all it does, it basically prompts to see whether your environment is open or closed. So it's like a burglar trying to see if your door is open or your window is open.
What does that mean? Your environment is for a non-techie. I call
Yeah,
this like
yeah.
non-tech.
It's a great
person.
question.
What does open or close mean, and how will advisors know if they're in an opened or closed environment?
So I think most folks around the world have some kind of connection to the internet. So when you work from home, you're working remotely, you have some kind of internet-enabled access to your work desktop, right? Or work environment or applications. That's a given. What happens is sometimes companies are moving very quick. We saw this during the pandemic, by the way. During the pandemic, everybody was rushing to home and remote work. They didn't have time to build security in. So they were like, okay, here's your VPN, here's your remote access, username and password, go. But as I mentioned earlier, you can brute force that. And once you had access because you didn't have MFA in, they're in your environment. So they're looking for you to make that mistake. So what are the hackers doing? What is the open and close? It's you being connected to the internet, accessing it from home, and potentially at that point having a situation where the hacker gets in because you didn't secure it properly, you used an easy password, or you didn't have MFA in place.
So don't fall prey. Don't fall prey to these hackers and put in place what you need to put in place to make sure that you're not the next cybersecurity victim.
So if your advisors want to know what should I be doing, this sounds really scary, it's really big, like this is sort of outside of my day-to-day job, right? When I travel, for example, if I'm going to Europe or if I'm going to the United States, before I leave, I call my IT department and I say, look, I'm going to be away. Do I need to do anything specific for my security? Do I need to change my MFA, log in, log out? Can you put a block? Because I will be in a different time zone for me not to connect at this time to this time because abnormal activity becomes available to you in terms of logging and watching what's going on in your environment. So there's steps you can take by calling the dealer IT infrastructure, for example, and asking them, look, I'm traveling for this period to this period. Can you lock my devices down as much as possible? I'm only going to have my phone or only my iPad or whatever device.
So you're talking about AI now making it easier for hackers or cyber criminals to perpetrate. How about AI to help advisors on their end, maybe protect against this? I'm sure that's the future, that there will be some sort of AI solution that can help make things more secure. And so, there's always, we talk about AI a lot and it's great in one way.
Yeah.
And then there's the flip side. And I think you've sort of gone over the flip side. But let's talk about regulations and laws. We'll talk about privacy. Privacy landscape is evolving in Canada, and that's relevant to advisors because they have obligations under privacy legislation and regulations. We know that we now have Law 25 in Quebec. People have referred to it as GDPR-esque.
Yeah.
And so what should advisors be aware of when it comes to privacy laws and their obligations currently, and potentially if they're dealing with, Quebec resident data now with Law 25?
So Canada's changing in terms of privacy landscape. So just to give folks a bit of background in terms of what we've seen over the last 20 years, Canada actually had a pretty static privacy landscape. What that means is we have 24 different privacy laws and data protection laws in the country. Really hard to keep track of it. Depends which industry, which province, what sector you're in. You have federal legislation, and then you have 3 provinces that I think our audience are most interested in: Quebec, Alberta, and BC. I won't bore folks with a constitutional discussion as to why there's a division of powers, but those 3 provinces have their own privacy laws, and then there's a federal law for anything that crosses borders, either interprovincial or outside of Canada, inside of Canada. Super important to know those 4 laws, provincial and federal. Quebec was the first one to amend its law. So when Europe adopted GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, Quebec said, we're going to be first mover. We're going to adopt this Law 25, which came in different tranches. It's not radically different than what we do. So the problem with our legislation was historically, we had some great principles, but we weren't really big on enforcement. And so you had the privacy commissioners come out with guidelines. We recommend you do the following. But it didn't really have the enforcement teeth it needed because it wasn't actually written down in the law itself.
Yeah.
So what Law 25 has done is basically codified a lot of that into the law. So you need to do these things. You need to do what we call, for example, a privacy impact assessment before you transfer data outside of Canada.
Yeah.
Or outside of Quebec. You need to make sure you have all these measures in place for safeguarding, like a privacy program and a variety of other things. So Quebec was first mover. The federal government said, hold on a second, we need to catch up too, because the Europeans are saying we're not up to snuff. So we need to make sure we amend it. There's a bill right now in front of Parliament, second reading, so quite advanced, which is making its way through. Probably going to get adopted because we have a year to this government before they come up for another election.
When do you think? I'm asked this question a lot. Do you know?
I don't know, but if I had to guess, it'd probably be in the fall. It is quite advanced, and there's two reasons for it. One, we do need to align ourselves with GDPR because our adequacy standard, again, this is sort of a legal term in the privacy world, where we can transfer data to Europe or receive from Europe without any encumbrances, is not forever. It's every reviewed or every 4 years. So we're up for that.
We have it now, and we're up for review. And did you say this fall or next fall?
I think this fall, the legislation is either going to pass or be very close to passing, but it won't come into force until 2025.
And let me clarify, is this legislation going to replace PIPEDA?
Yes.
Okay, because I think our advisors know what PIPEDA or PIPEDA is. And so this legislation will replace PIPEDA. And tell us about it.
So it's very interesting because it's different than what we have. So there's significant financial fines associated with it. There's this concept of having a data tribunal, unheard of. So what we had up until this point was a commissioner federally under PIPEDA who could take certain actions.
Right.
Under the new proposed bill, they can still do that. The commissioner has some powers, but if you want to issue a massive fine for non-compliance, you have to go to the tribunal, and there's a private right of action. So individuals can go before the tribunal and say, I've been wrong for the following reason. There's some conditions that go along with it, but generally speaking, that's the approach. The challenge with this is, and this is where it gets tricky, we're very Canadian. We like to have consensus. So even when we had the previous regime, so 3 provinces, Quebec, Alberta, BC, plus the federal one, we have what we call substantially similar requirements. So you go to Alberta, you go to Quebec, you go federally, there aren't that many changes or differences. There's some nuances, but nothing major. Here, you've got an enforcement regime which is draconianly different than what you have in Quebec. Quebec, the commissioner can issue a fine as a right. Federally, you cannot. So how do you make them two work? Is there a possibility of being double hit with a penalty for the same transgression or violation? These are all questions which have not been actually sorted out yet. So more to come on that.
So without getting too legal, high level, to comply with, privacy laws in Canada, what do you want to be thinking about?
You want to have a plan. Right now, and this is the easiest way to comply with it, look at Law 25 and try to implement it across the board. And the reason I say that is the outgoing federal privacy commissioner, before he left in his last press conference, said, we should be looking at Quebec as the blueprint for the rest of Canada, regardless of what legislation is adopted. So if you're complying with Quebec legislation, chances are you're going to be in very good stead for the rest of the country as well.
Good to know. Okay, we're almost at time, but I got to ask you about deepfakes because there's been a lot of discussion around this. There's a lot of deepfakes on the internet, people who have become prey or succumbed to these, savvy, I guess, are they cyber criminals that are creating the deepfake? I guess we can call them that. And done certain things as a result of, the deepfake impersonating an individual. So how can I tell if I'm seeing the real individual versus a deepfake that's impersonating someone?
So it's what you talked about earlier. AI can be used for good, but also for bad. It's a tool. It's like a hammer, right? Are you going to use it for good things? And there's tons of great applications that advisors are using it for, like know your client and taking notes in meetings and a variety of other things. On the flip side, it is being used for deep fakes. So basically impersonation of people who have not said anything. So if you can capture, for example, somebody's voice for a period of roughly about 2 minutes, you can actually create a whole conversation, which never took place, created by deepfakes using artificial intelligence. You can do the same thing on Teams in some cases, where you can actually broadcast a message. So we're seeing, for example, in particular in the area of wire fraud, a lot of deepfakes. The AMF, the Autorité des marchés financiers in Quebec, actually issued guidelines on. They have a blog post on deepfakes, which is maintained regularly, where they said, be very vigilant for requests coming in for wire transfers. So for example, we talked about MFA earlier. Wire transfers typically, hey, I'd like to transfer this amount to a Hong Kong-based bank. All right, let's do a double validation. Let's call the person and validate it. Well, what they're doing now is they'll say, okay, please transfer this to a Hong Kong bank account. By the way, I'm going to call you later to confirm my transaction. And then they call you after hours typically, leave you a voice message saying, this is legitimate. Please transfer the funds. So you got that double authentication, right? You think you're doing it right. And there's this great case, unfortunate for the organization, but the person there did everything right. Based in Hong Kong, transferred roughly about $20 million after having done the checks. So this is happening now. It's not hypothetical, theoretical. To your point, what should you be doing? Your spidey sense. Why are we transferring this to a Hong Kong-based account, for example? I'm just giving that as an example. Yeah. Why is this amount being cashed today? Why are we transferring it for this purpose? Pick up the phone, talk to your client, validate the rationale, and make sure you're comfortable with the answer before you do the transfers.
Some amazing advice for our advisors, and I truly enjoyed this discussion. Very enlightening. Be savvy, be vigilant.
Spidey sense.
Spidey sense. If there's anything you take away, if your spidey senses go off, double check.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Imran.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Fidelity Connects podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Fidelity Connects on your podcast platform of choice. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a review or a 5-star rating. Fidelity mutual funds and ETFs are available by working with a financial advisor or through an online brokerage account. Visit fidelity.ca/howtobuy for more information. On fidelity.ca, you can also find more information on future live webcasts, and don't forget to follow Fidelity Canada on Twitter. Thanks again. See you next time. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Fidelity Investments Canada ULC or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment, tax, or legal advice. It is not an offer to sell or buy, or an endorsement, recommendation, or sponsorship of any entity or security cited. Read a fund's prospectus before investing. Funds are not guaranteed. Their values change frequently, and past performance may not be repeated. Fees, expenses, and commissions are all associated with fund investments.